Imagine surviving in a world where every single meal is uncertain. You spend hours hunting animals that might escape. You search forests for berries that may not exist. One bad season, one long drought, one failed hunt, and your entire family could starve. Now, imagine someone discovers a strange liquid. It smells different. It bubbles on its own. It tastes nothing like water. After drinking it, people begin laughing. They talk louder. They become unusually friendly. Some even start dancing around the fire. Today, we call it beer. But here's the mystery. How did ancient humans accidentally invent one of the world's oldest drinks? Thousands of years before chemistry, laboratories, or even written history. The answer begins with something almost every ancient human feared: wasting food. For most of human history, food wasn't simply valuable. It was life itself. Every grain of wild barley, every seed of wild wheat, every handful of edible plants represented hours of dangerous work. Nothing could be thrown away. That's why archaeologists believe the invention of beer wasn't the result of a brilliant idea. It was probably the result of a mistake. Imagine a small group of hunter-gatherers collecting wild grains near the edge of a river. Unlike meat, grains could be stored for weeks or even months if kept dry. So people gathered more than they immediately needed, placed inside woven baskets, leather bags, or simple clay containers. Then the weather changed. Rainwater leaked inside. The grains became damp. At first, that looked like a disaster. Wet grain usually spoiled. Most people would probably throw it away. But nature had other plans. Floating all around us are tiny organisms called wild yeast. You can't see them. You can't smell them. Yet they land on fruit, plants, tree bark, even grains. When those damp grains sat in warm conditions, something incredible happened. The yeast began eating the natural sugars inside the grain. As it fed, it released tiny bubbles of carbon dioxide. And something else: alcohol. The mixture slowly transformed into a weak, slightly sour drink unlike anything humans had tasted before. Of course, ancient people had absolutely no idea what yeast was. The first microscope wouldn't be invented for thousands of years. To them, it must have seemed almost magical. One day, they had wet grain. A few days later, they had something completely different. But here's the strange part. The earliest beer probably didn't taste very good. Forget the cold golden drink you're imagining today. It was likely thick, cloudy, full of grain particles, barely fizzy, closer to a watery porridge than a modern beer. So why would anyone drink it? The answer might surprise you. It was safer than water. That sounds impossible. Today, clean drinking water is easy to find in many parts of the world. But ancient humans often drank from rivers, ponds, and streams shared with wild animals, sources that could carry dangerous bacteria and parasites. It wasn't the alcohol that made early beer safer. The alcohol content was far too low for that. It was the process itself. Heating water during brewing killed many of the bacteria that made untreated river water dangerous. The result lasted longer than fresh grain, too. The fermented mixture could be consumed over several days without spoiling. Suddenly, what looked like ruined food had become something genuinely useful. And humans noticed. But was this really an accident? Or did ancient people intentionally create beer from the very beginning? That's where the story becomes even more fascinating. Archaeologists working in Israel discovered evidence at a site known as Raqefet Cave, where the Natufian people lived roughly 13,000 years ago. Inside the cave, they found stone mortars containing microscopic traces of fermented starch, residues many researchers believe came from one of the oldest known beer-like beverages ever produced. Here's the shocking part. This was thousands of years before agriculture became widespread. People may have been brewing a primitive form of beer before they were even farming on a large scale. If that's true, it completely changes the story. Beer wasn't created after civilization. It may have helped inspire it. And that raises an even bigger question. What if ancient humans didn't start growing grain just to bake bread? What if they also wanted to brew more beer? For decades, archaeologists believed agriculture existed for one simple reason. People wanted a steady supply of food. It seemed obvious. Grow grain, bake bread, feed more people. End of story. But then researchers began asking a strange question. If making bread was the goal, why spend so much effort collecting enormous amounts of grain before farming even existed? Wild barley and wheat weren't easy to harvest. Each plant produced only a handful of edible seeds. Gathering enough for even a small meal could take hours. Yet archaeological sites show prehistoric communities collecting these grains in surprisingly large quantities. That doesn't make much sense unless they had another reason. Perhaps early humans weren't just making bread. Perhaps they were making beer. Imagine a successful hunt. For the first time in weeks, everyone has enough food. Instead of eating separately, the entire group gathers around a fire. Someone brings a container filled with a strange, fermented drink. People pass it around. Laughter grows louder. Stories become more dramatic. Music begins. Strangers become friends. Children watch their elders celebrate. Without realizing it, beer may have been doing something far more important than simply making people feel relaxed. It was bringing communities together. Even today, psychologists know that sharing food and drink strengthens social bonds. Ancient humans didn't understand brain chemistry, but they understood experience. Groups that celebrated together often trusted one another more. That trust could mean the difference between survival and disaster. During harsh winters, neighboring families might share food instead of fighting. During dangerous hunts, people were more willing to cooperate. Beer wasn't just changing moods. It was helping build relationships. Then something extraordinary happened. Around 10,000 years ago, humans began settling in permanent villages. Fields replaced wild grasslands. Grain was no longer gathered from nature. It was planted deliberately. Most history books tell us agriculture was invented to feed growing populations. That is certainly true, but some researchers believe another motivation existed alongside it. A reliable supply of grain also meant a reliable supply of fermented drinks. Whether beer inspired farming or farming simply made brewing easier, the two became closely connected. As civilizations grew, beer evolved with them. In ancient Mesopotamia, workers were paid with grain and beer. Temples brewed large quantities for religious ceremonies. Some of the oldest written recipes in human history describe brewing rather than cooking. In ancient Egypt, beer was consumed by farmers, builders, and nobles alike, not as a luxury, but as an ordinary part of daily life. Yet despite these advances, the basic process had hardly changed. Water, grain, yeast, time. Nature still performed the hardest work. Humans simply learned how to guide it. Beer wasn't invented by a king. It wasn't discovered by a scientist. And it certainly wasn't created inside a laboratory. It emerged from countless small accidents. A forgotten basket of wet grain. Wild yeast floating through the air. Someone curious enough to taste the result instead of throwing it away. Generation after generation, people repeated what worked, without understanding microbes, without understanding fermentation, without even knowing why it happened. They simply observed, experimented, remembered. So, did ancient humans accidentally invent beer? The evidence suggests they probably did. Not because they were searching for alcohol, not because they dreamed of opening the world's first brewery, but because they were trying to save food, survive another season, and make the most of every precious resource they had. The alcohol came later. The celebrations came later. The civilizations came later. It all began with a handful of forgotten grain and one accident that would eventually spread across the entire world. Sometimes, humanity's greatest inventions aren't born from genius. They're born from curiosity and a lucky mistake.